Welcome back to Democracy Tomorrow, everyone. Today we have with us former Canadian diplomat and scholar Diego Orsorio, who is actually speaking to us from the wild streets of Amsterdam, where he's visiting, but his normal residence is Montreal, and obviously that is in the country, the wonderful, lovely Great White North country of Canada. So Diego's worked all around the world in all sorts of diplomatic positions, all sorts of UN agencies, peace operations, and all the rest, and has extensive experience working across the world within the humanitarian sector, and now works from his uh, home country, which is Canada. So we thought we'd spend just a few minutes in early May 2025 speaking to a Canadian citizen about what it's like to be a Canadian during the regime of the Trump administration in the United States. Let me just start before I ask you a specific question, quoting a couple of lines from the United Nations Charter. This is the most important law that exists in the entire international community. It's the law upon which all subsequent international laws and human rights treaties have been based. It was a law that was drafted in San Francisco in the United States at the leadership driven by entirely United States officials on the tail end of the Second World War from April till June 1945. Let me just read a couple of lines from the UN Charter to remind people what this document is all about. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and the equal rights of men and women, of nations large and small. It goes on in the preamble, speaking about the importance of practicing tolerance and living together in peace with one another as good neighbors. Famously, in Article 1 of the Charter, it speaks about the need to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. So bearing those lines in mind and the hundreds of other lines in this cornerstone document within the area of international law, which completely forbids the threat or the use of force against any other sovereign nation based upon the rules and regulations that we have universally established for centuries. What is it like to live in a country which has been actively threatened by the head of state of the United States of America, traditionally the closest possible ally that Canada has? And how are people feeling about it?
Uh, I would start by saying maybe I can quote my new prime minister, Mark Carney. This is like in a love relationship, you get betrayed. You might forgive, but you will not forget. And that shapes the future. There will be a space for some sort of reconciliation if things radically change. But in a behavioral Pavlovian way, the heart never forgets. And this has been something that has been quite essential in terms of the relationship. Many Americans do say that we are family, we're not just a country, and we feel that way as well. But this has been a wake up call, something that goes beyond the rational element. It's a wake up call to the hypothalamus. It's something that has been registered at the cellular level and the fiber of every Canadian. And this goes for both Anglo and Francophone Canadians, first generation and multiple generation Canadians, because it's a threat to the civic essence of Canadians. It's not a threat to a nationality or a historical thing, although we had some of those. In this day and age, it's a threat to the fabric of what we have established. Some folks have said that President Trump hates the European Union for multiple reasons, but one of the main things is that it is an anathema to the worldview that he has. And I guess Canada is the most European of the non European countries in many ways, as an interesting way of putting it. And so that anathema is just across the border for him. And if he wants to rewrite the basic design of society at his image in this very different way of considering the place of humans and human dignity into the state, while having folks with healthcare, a pretty decent democracy, and a society that is quite to a certain degree, I would say, built on the notion of empathy and civic engagement, is basically a very direct threat. And so, I'm also a historian, and you asked me how we feel. I'm debating whether we feel like Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Austria at the 1930 somethings before the beginning of the Second World War. It's somewhere in between. Is Poland feeling the threat, Czechoslovakia assuming the worst and maybe feeling that we're going to be left out of some sort of a solidarity circle and will be traded off, or Austria, in which the annexation or the desire for annexation runs deeper because it's done in a non-conscious manner. I mean, there's basically a whole set of engagements presented by President Trump as threatening the economy, moving things within the flows of trade, and basically a whole frame of undermining what we are so that we no longer be, so that we can be with them, so that they can be themselves. And so these multiple layers of engagement feel particularly devious and ill-intentioned, and to a certain degree, source of major concern for all of us.
I completely agree with that. And I mean, it's very clear that the Trump effect was massive on the election results just a few days ago in Canada. And had he not made those threats, those illegal threats, the current opposition and the previous opposition probably would have won that election hands down. And it was so bad that the head of the opposition, Polyev, didn't even win his seat back. Ironically, tomorrow are the elections in Australia, a country really similar to Canada in countless ways in terms of our size, in terms of our, position in the Commonwealth and the head of state and all of those types of things. And also an ally, or at least former ally, tentative ally with the United States. And that very same effect, I can tell you, on the other side of the world is playing out here. So 2, 3, 4 months ago, the conservative parties here, they're called the Liberal and National Party Coalition, they were definitely ahead in the polls quite considerably. And it looked like the current Labor government was going to lose. And now it looks like, who knows, but tomorrow we will finally know. But it looks very likely that Labor will retain government here, primarily because, again, of the Trump effect. So it's completely blown back in his face. And when you
Yeah.
see that, his popularity rating is the lowest ever in the history for any president in that country in the first 100 days, the economy is going backwards. The population is slowly but surely losing interest in his particular way of doing business, particularly with regard to the tariffs and so on. Who knows what the end result will be? But I mean, you have hundreds upon hundreds of agreements with the United States, the Canadian state. You're both NATO members. You've had a peaceful, largely unguarded border for 200 years or so, and now everything seems to have changed so much so that if he follows through in these threats, we have this extraordinary, unprecedented, unimaginable situation where two NATO countries could be firing at one another. And then what happens then?
Well, I don't think it will be a matter of firing. I don't think this will ever lead to that, purely because we will not do. But I do believe that if the threats are in any measure real, they demonstrate a certain type of engagement towards neighbors and friends that will certainly put us in a very antagonizing position. If the threats are not real, it's even worse because that means you're willing to damage the essence of a symbiotic relationship that is essential for the United States for purposes that are either ill-defined or very short-term oriented. And that doesn't show a high level of statesmanship anyway. The concern we have is that at one point or another is not going to be a state-directed violence, but it will be the kind of osmosis of the social violence that might happen on the other side of the border, and the transgression of the social norms that we have in our country. We do have, I mean, Mr. Trump complains a lot about fentanyl, but we should be the ones complaining about the immense amount of illegal trading on weapons that happens to filter down in all the cities in Canada. Almost every gunfire in Toronto and as part of a crime has some sort of connections to something that happened on the other side. Drugs trafficking doesn't happen if you don't have drug consumption. And so the demand is actually happening inside. And that's a very issue. I mean, but the most important thing is this technology backed attempt to monopolize the truth, to weaponize reality, and to transform it into a tool of regime change or social change. And that's the most difficult thing, because obviously we have this very strange confluence of technology, digital techniques, and advanced management of behavioral science, and all together is leading to something in which you basically can, you in an Orwellian way, you can define reality not by what you see, but what you actually want to convey the others to believe. And so that's the problem for us right now. I mean, uh, beyond what you see on the streets, the Twitter sphere, or the X sphere as it's called now, the media sphere is highly penetrated by these very uh, evil kind of engagement. And we are proud Canadians. However, I will not be blind to the fact that those ideas are penetrating the social fabric. We have at this moment decent two-digit figure of people that will say, "Hey, it would be great to be the 51st state." You have fellows that if you put it to a referendum, it's not going to be zero. It will be 20 something. It will be 10 something. And then, once you have that, if you engage on the appropriate time of psychological ops, you can get those numbers to change. So it's a concern, because intention means the moral vacuity that allows you to engage in such an action.
Well, I've heard countless stories of Canadians being unable to sleep at night, Canadians being truly worried and truly terrified that threats like this are being made. And as you said before, these things you do not quickly forget. Even if it's said in jest, you don't
Yeah.
say things like this to your extremely peaceful neighbor. I have a theory, could be completely wrong, but given the state of mind of the person that has been making those threats, it seems pretty feasible to me. I did a little calculation and I looked at the size in square miles of Russia. And then I looked at what it would be if you took the United States plus its other areas, the non-contiguous United States, Alaska and Hawaii, and you added Canada and you added Greenland, and it just surpasses the size of Russia at that stage when you include those things. So I definitely think, again, the chance is not zero that is the true motivation, because bigger is always better.
Well, or maybe in a proto-patriarchal way, he thinks that size matters.
I think there's something like that. I think it's definitely something like that. I was kind of joking about it before the election to my other Canadian friends, of which there are many. That somehow like threats like this were going to be made. Absolutely not thinking they would be, and out of the blue, there they were. It wasn't part of the political party program. Wasn't announced very much at his raving rallies, but once the
Yeah.
election happened, there it came.
Yeah, but you see, when you work in conflicts, and I worked in many, many conflicts, and you understand the the spiral curve of development in any type of social conflict, the most important thing is to remember that everything is possible, that everything could happen given the right set of conditions and circumstances. And so it is a wake-up call for those that believe that resilience is some sort of a fixed value. It's not. Resilience is a very variable feature in every society, and you always have to prepare as a fireman. You know, you prepare the best possible way, hoping that you never have to get to use your skill. But if the time comes, then you're ready. And that's something that's many societies who happen to benefit from peace tend to fall in the complacent approach of the fact that you take peace for granted. And it has been a great wake up call. You see, Canadians have always been taught that we are a country above the United States, and the geography, the way you perceive it, will make you feel that way. However, the real thing is that Canada is a country between the United States and Russia. And that changes the perspective, and that changes the geostrategic analysis that you have to use to define what is the security equation for us. We are in between Russia and the United States. And so if one of those pieces of the sandwich is not exactly friendly, and we can assume that was the case before Trump, and then we have the second piece of the sandwich now getting close to that area, then we are in a hell of a sandwich, a very difficult one. See? And that changes everything. And because of geography and the regulations of the different networks that happen to exist around the world, by value, by economy, by engagement, by social tendencies, by civic nature, we happen to be outside of the protective walls of certain institutions. We are outside of the European Union, although since the 90s I've been an advocate for let's figure out a way. We should. People called me crazy, and then last year the Economist came up with an article saying you should think about it.
Is
We
that
should
a
figure.
realistic prospect that Canada would formally
Well,
join the European Union?
well, there is something in the European Union, and in terms of the terms of the European Union, that indicate that you need to have geographic geographic continuity. But if that is the requirement, as a good lawyer will say, well, we have a border with Denmark in a small island,
Yeah.
and we have a water network border with France on Saint Pierre and Miquelon, and so we technically meet that. There's also some other requirements, so it might not be necessarily possible to aspire ever to have a full membership, but there are many other things. And I look at the EFTA trade agreement, and as it stands now, it's also the same thing. It's based for Europeans, but those are words in a treaty that can be changed. If I had any say in terms of this kind of geopolitical engagement, I will put a lot of resources on figuring out a solution to maximize the amount of engagement within the European Union. I guess some of us have been doing that. Some of us have been exploring that, but more than what the conservative approach to diplomacy will dictate. I mean, we have a trade agreement. We should have a Schengen kind of expansion. We should have a trade kind of expansion. We should try to build up on this kind of a natural complementarity, and make it happen as a matter of first priority.
Right. Well, I mean, Canada and very much Australia are very open immigration countries that have, benefited immensely from the processes of immigration. I mean, in recent years, Australia takes in anywhere between 200 and 400,000 new immigrants a year. And Canada, I think, is perhaps even a million a year or something like that. I mean, it's quite a few. I don't know if you've seen this recent survey that was done by the Harris polling company that indicated that 42% of Americans were considering leaving the country for good or had taken active measures to do so. So I don't know who they were asking or what the criteria were, but if that is even close to true, obviously a huge number of those people will attempt to go to Canada. You hear people saying it all the time. I'm going to
Yeah,
Canada if Trump wins again, and so on and so forth. But in the end, countries which are immigrant friendly, like Canada, Australia, like the United States used to be, benefit massively from that immigration and lose when the prospect of losing population occurs. And, look around the
yeah,
world, countries that are losing population are in a situation of desperation to get more people to come there. Italy, Hungary, Japan, South Korea, Russia, you name it, countries are losing population and they're suffering economically as a result. So that could very well be one of the outcomes of this tension between the United States and Canada, where Canada benefits massively by U.S. immigration, should they
well, I
be
mean,
allowed, and the U.S. will lose massively by the huge brain drain, which is already well underway. Anecdotally, I would say a huge proportion of my American friends have sought my advice. How'd you do it? How'd you leave the country? What do you have to do? How do you get residency?
Yeah.
What's a nomad visa? How do I buy a passport, et cetera, et cetera? So,
Right.
what do you think about that?
Well, number one, I mean, immigration is really a blessing, but like everything, you have to do it in a way that is organized, is well settled, well defined. Because, like in everything, if you look at hydrodynamics, right? When you put two different liquids, at one point, the way they balance each other goes by a certain process. You have different densities, stuff like that. Immigration is like that. You take a whole society, you bring in new people with the purpose of facilitating the bigger growth and a maximization of the potentialities of that whole society. That, you don't bring 10 million people on a country of 6 million people. That's not what you do. You do it in a way that is properly handled, and that's what Canada has been able to do until now. Uh, the issue is that when you instrumentalize immigration as a kind of a narrative objective to mobilize people, not targeting the rational, but targeting the guts, then you can make it into very nasty. And it's not immigrants, it's the other on capital letters.
Hmm.
If you had no immigrants in the United States, he will be picking up something against red hair people or people with blue eyes or whatever. It always brings me back to that 1960s episode of a Star Trek in which you had the fight between the black and white against the white and blacks.
Hmm.
I don't remember the name of that episode, but that's what it is. And in every fascist and every kind of authoritarian approach in which you want to mobilize people with the guts so that they support your political agenda, you have to find an enemy that is visible, that ideally won't be able to defend itself, and that you can easily spot so that you can redirect anger and redirect the frustration that people have. In a controlled way, that's where we have sports. And sometimes Chomsky will say, well, and hell, how they use it. In an uncontrolled way, you have abuse, like the one that's happening. And that is certainly a dangerous thing. Now, it is true. Nobody can say they have the clean hands on this matter. There is also xenophobia. There's also sort of things in Canada. But in any place where you have interfaces between people from two different groups, there's going to be some sort of friction while things readapt. Okay. But if you make it a policy to deny the fact that the entire country was built on the sweat, the hard work, and the blood of immigrants, you're not defining only the essence of the country, you're also redefining the history, and you are, in a way, kidnapping the potential of the future of the country itself. If Americans go and see the Ellis Island and they see it as a benchmark in the development of the country, and now we say that immigrants are bad, then what do you do? So what happens with Ellis? And what happens with the Irish? I mean, you look at New York, 5 points. The place was a point of high level integration, nasty, brutish, violent, but it was one thing that eventually became something else. Uh, that's what happened. And the other thing is that the immigrant is only the immigrant from the moment that he decides to move from point A to point B. When he reaches the new society, he can remain an immigrant or he can become a new citizen in a new society. And plus, an addition, a new added value. It depends on all those who are facing that kind of engagement, whether they can make it into a plus or a minus for the society. See, I am Hispanic. I immigrated to Canada in a very strange way because my parents sent me when I was a young kid. So I didn't have to go to those paths and the whole decisions. Basically, I've been Canadian most of my life. But I was an immigrant. I'm no longer an immigrant. I'm a citizen. I have background of a different country, but I'm full-fledged, 300% as Canadian as the Prime Minister because the system, the institution enabled me to be that way. I could be potentially prime minister. I could be potentially anything in the country. And the fact that the system has created the institutional path to facilitate that is quite unique. That's what I call the Canadian miracle. Having those distinctions, and those, my criticism also goes for some European countries, is what creates that power differential that creates so many problems. And no, I guess in Canada somehow we got it right on that particular element, and the results have been amazing. And you see our members of cabinet, the guy with a turban, the lady with a hijab, have a distinction, and that's fine, and that's good. That's good for us. And so it's saying no to a great source of social wealth when you try to say no to it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's been immigration and the so-called other in quotes, has been used by despots throughout the ages as the most convenient way to galvanize, fear-based support for their, evil intentions. And particularly in the case of the United States, the ultimate immigration country, if there ever was one, to use that is just, hypocritical beyond measure. But that's the way the world is today. But, I believe, all empires come to an end at some point in time, and not a single empire throughout the history of humanity has ever withered away in a proud and dignified manner. They almost all hold on until the bitter end. And I think what's happening now in the United States is very much following that same sort of process.
But they could manage that transition. You see, people have history books, people have records, and there's even a Harvard professor of mine who talks about this famous transition that to see the straps. Basically, history shows that some empires can have a transition in the most constructive way. So the interface between the UK and the US wasn't that bad. The interface between the Germans and the UK was a little bit, and it's a matter of choice. But now that we mentioned this thing about the transitions in history, one of the things I always like to bring to the discussion is when you read a book like The Decline of the Roman Empire by Gibbons, okay, among the many things that the guy wrote in them, one is the fact that at one point, when society stops growing for the benefit of the most, but it basically implodes by eating up the resources from within, that's what you have decline. And if you look at all social policies and the ideological framework of the neoliberal agenda that happens exists in the United States, you make the money by cutting on the insurance of the people inside. You make the money by exploiting folks inside. You make the money not by maximizing or creating new added value, but by trying to reduce what the other is getting. And so you still make millions, but not because you created millions. It's because you grab and snatch millions out of your fellow citizens and the wealth. And that's one thing that has to be remembered because it's the first steps towards the fast catalyzation of decline.
Absolutely. And, famously, the Roman Empire declined following the so-called Golden Age, right? And I've noticed in recent days that Trump started using that phrase all the time, right? We are entering a new golden age. We're doing this and that. We're going to become the greatest of all time. And, that's a very, dangerous point of view. But let's hope that the vast majority of Americans see Canada as a friendly neighbor, that they have visited the country before, they welcome Canadians to come there who are now increasingly not going there. And that, 91 million Americans above the age of 18 did not vote in the 2024 election, which is a staggering sum. It's 36% of the entire adult population didn't even vote. So if we take those people plus the ones that didn't vote for Trump, you have a huge majority of people who are probably pretty reasonable and very happy to continue the status quo friendly relations between Canada and the United States. And let's hope that it continues that way, and that this recent period of tumult is a warning sign to both sides, that cooperation and collaboration and friendship and mutual trade and all of those things are infinitely better for both sides than the alternative that's being proposed. So let's hope it
That's
goes in that
that I
direction.
hope as well. I do hope that, but I, as a political scientist, historian. When you give me that number, I respond to you. Yes, but they did not vote. And what will make them vote the next time? What will be the threshold trigger that will actually get them to vote? Then where is the vitality of the social tissue when citizens do not engage? They did not engage when it was threatening yet not real. Would they do it now that is real? Well, it will be too late, because you know as well as I do that there are substantial efforts right now to subvert even the constitutional restrictions on the next term. And the other thing is a law of institutional evolution. Once you lower the threshold, nobody comes back and raise it up. So all the damage and erosion of freedoms and civic engagement and the vitality of institutions is not going to be fixed just because we have a different government in ideally the next 4 years. Uh, those damages remain, and people adapt to the new lower threshold. So with Trump or without Trump, we will still be living in a Trump influence context. Whoever is the best case scenario, somebody trying to reverse the tendency. Worst case scenario, somebody doubling down on that particular tendency.
Yeah, that could be. But there is, a degree of hope on the other, looked at from the opposite side. What occurred in the United States following the Nixon fiasco and Watergate and his resignation and all of that. I mean, the type of institutions that they set up to guard against that ever happening again
Yeah,
were unlike anything that had preceded them, and now they're all being walked over and canceled and this and that. But at least that was the systemic response to an attempt to do what amounted to criminal behavior by that president. So hopefully, following the end of this regime, enough people in enough places in the United States will realize that isolating themselves as a country is detrimental on all sorts of fronts, that being enemies to your friendly neighbors is not beneficial to anybody, and that losing your population because of the type of governance structures you've decided to have are equally detrimental. So all of these things
yeah,
are harming ordinary American citizens. And, it's like the argument I always make, the United States has about the poorest record of any developed country ratifying basic human rights treaties, right? They're greatly reluctant to do it. Of course, they have this huge animosity against the International Criminal Court. They don't respect the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, which is meant to maintain peace and security. They have a horrible point of view towards international law and human rights laws in particular. But I still firmly believe that if ordinary American citizens realized what they were losing out on by not being the beneficiaries of the rights that people across the world have when their governments ratify human rights treaties, things would be different. And
yeah,
I think deep down inside, a lot of it is really, it's like at a psychological level. And there's an essence, I think, amongst many in America who even think about countries besides themselves, which is the minority. The vast majority of Americans do not travel overseas. They don't have passports. The list goes on. They're very inward looking people. But those that do look outside and who do know people from Canada and Mexico and France and all these kind of places, I believe there's an element of admiration and almost envy that they wish they could live in cities where there were no guns. They wish they could take 3-hour lunches drinking wine and work only a 35-hour work week. They wish they had a lot of the things that their allies and their neighbors have, but that the system does not allow them to have, and that the culture does not allow them to have.
but let me be a bit of a devil's advocate on this. I mean, those numbers that you mentioned, they probably reflect the real problem in the US. But if you struggle like hell to just basically meet the basics, can you afford to think of taking a vacation?
Sure.
If you are
Sure.
scared like shit for the day you break a leg means almost bankruptcy, would you be thinking of going to Spain or Italy? It's also
Absolutely.
social. It's a socioeconomic component. I mean, the typical
Certainly.
image that I have several here: American tourists with a Europe guy checking Amsterdam and doing things here. That's middle upper class
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
middle class
Sure.
just because they saved 6 years to do it. I
Yeah.
mean, we can control people not just with force. We can control people with economic frameworks
Mm.
and uh, placing so many basic things that belong to the state as a responsibility into the hands of the private market means that we expose the citizen not to be a citizen. We make it into a functional economic creature that needs to struggle to survive. Ergo, busy to worry about having a 3 hour break and wine, go and learn Italian in Toscana, or just take a little trip to Europe. It's
Mm-hmm.
also that. Uh,
Sure.
one day I was in a class at the Kennedy School, and I said, you know, the health of Americans should be considered a matter of national security. If people are sick, if every kid is sick, then the state, the country suffers. And it was a radical idea. And then my colleagues, people from the army and from all different parties were like, what? No, it's a market thing. No, it's not. The health of every citizen, and I say that as an asthmatic kid who need glasses and has been using the health system quite a bit. Uh, you know, if I'm not healthy, the country's weak because I cost money or because I will be spending time doing things that I shouldn't be doing. Asthmatic kids, and I was a volunteer. And look, I mean, my wife is American. I have American relatives 3 generations back. I've been to yeah, almost 49 states in the American Union. I've been in and out of the United States for many years, and I studied there. So, I mean, it's a country that I know as an extension of my own country. I've been a volunteer in places in hospitals where a kid of 10 years old needs to go to emergency to get a puff of ventilator just because he doesn't have the insurance to buy one, you know? And I know what it is to need ventilator. It's just a puff, right? So if it comes
Sure.
down to that, we have a huge problem. And that's one thing that needs to be considered in terms of how people want to redefine society. I mean, the
Totally.
market is a great allocator of resources provided that everybody is on the equal foot. And if we're not on the equal foot, it's
Mm.
not a great. That's a clear thing.
Well, I mean, anywhere between 60 to 70% of Americans essentially live paycheck to paycheck with
Yeah.
virtually or no savings whatsoever, and certainly no sort of backup. And so if you're in that position and you're also very unlikely to be a member of a trade union as well in that country, in contrast to many other countries, yeah, the chances of you, so-called getting ahead or having the time indeed to travel and things of that nature are obviously, not possible. But I think it's that true reality within the United States for most people that is not widely enough known either internationally, but also within the confines of that country.
I think more than known is to be seen that way. We frame the narrative about, you have a chance to get ahead if you work hard, and you have a chance to get ahead if you're really, if you play on innovation. But Michael Sandel has mentioned it, and so others as well. Meritocracy is not such a thing as in the United States. Now most of the money and most of the wealth and the privilege is inherited. So if you are coming from all money, well, it's actually expected that you're going to carry on. But if you're not coming from all money, what is the chance for you to actually have a chance and make it on your own? And not everybody is Thomas Alva Edison or Henry Ford that has a great idea and come up with the money on your own, and that's not the case.
Mm.
So, it's important to remember that when we create a narrative for society and people buy it, it's a narrative that tends to maximize the gains and minimize the shortcomings. And in the case of the United States, we have a narrative of the individual hard work thing, the American dream. The
Hmm.
American dream, in real terms, was a dream for the post-war generation, more likely if you were white, and more likely if you were of a certain type in the patriarchal framework. Uh, when you see the disposition for uh, Black African American Army veterans, and you see their whole analysis of how things were handled in terms of other minorities, well, you see that the game wasn't fair and it wasn't equal, and it remains that way.
Absolutely. Well, you know, The quest here at Democracy Tomorrow is to get ideas out there about the current system in which we have chosen to have ourselves governed, both in Canada, the United States, but particularly in the rest of the world, the global South and the global North. And, it's through discussions like these that we can, begin to realize that the contemporary structures that govern many societies have a long way to go before we reach a point where we've achieved, prosperity, equality, and justice for everybody. And, a global system that was premised on those things, in our view, is far preferable to maintaining a status quo where basic principles of international law can be trounced upon so easily. So, any final
Very
thoughts
much.
today, Diego? I'll leave you to wander through the streets of Amsterdam now, but just any final thoughts on what it means to be a Canadian in 2025?
Well, I guess two things about being a Canadian. I think, and I want to measure my words on this. Is being a Canadian is basically being part of humanity's best second chance. Okay, because it's a country that does offer a bit of it's like a real time simulation of how other things could be as well. We have people from different parts of the planet, and after a while, they're Canadian and they can be elected and they can be part of any institutional element. We do have social class, we do have inequality, we have major issues, but I work on complexity science a lot, and this is the country that has, until today, despite all its shortcomings, a high degree of resilience, a high level of redundancy, and an engagement towards ensuring that empathy, which is a muscle, is exercised. It has to change because we're losing ground big time. But my benchmark is in terms of what it was before. It's not exactly the same benchmark as what I have in other places. So we have Canada has great assets. One of them is the social capital and the way we define Canadian. And yet you have neo Nazis and you have right wingers and you have all these sorts of things. But you can still think that the core of society is willing to have for a better future. And the second thing about Canada, and that for me is an important thing for what the world is going through at the moment, is that as a country, we do hope that others can also find that moment of equilibrium within their culture, their aspiration, their the degree of partake that they want to have in society. Um, you will notice, and I think it's something that makes me quite proud, that despite the massive and somehow collective drop in international aid worldwide, um, our prime minister said that our international aid is not going to be curtailed massively. Uh, we don't pay for everything. We don't have immense amount of money, but in terms of the intention and the purpose, we do understand that international aid is essential. It's a way of conveying and maintaining an engagement with the rest of the world. And we understand it for that. We don't see it as a zero sum game, which I only give you money if you have something to give back. That, in regards to the Ukrainian economic agreement and other things, is something that I would like to highlight for the world to look into. We have major problems. I'm concerned about my country, but at the same time, I think that I thank the universe because where I am and I'm in the best possible position to try to help others.
Right on. Well, on that positive note, we'll wrap it up here. So, thank you for watching, everybody. This is Democracy Tomorrow. Subscribe and like when you can, and we will see you the next time.